Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining me. Today, we are going to learn about fairy tales. Our story today is actually a collection of stories written by Hans Christian Andersen. It is a collection of stories. It does not have illustrations, but they are all about fairy tales. So, if you are wondering what makes a story a fairy tale, well, there are many different elements to it. Usually, you know it's a fairy tale when your story begins with something like once upon a time and it ends with and they lived happily ever after. A fairy tale usually has a variety of characters. It is fiction for sure, which means it does not happen in real life. Sometimes there are witches, sometimes there are fairies. There are always good characters and bad characters. And there is always a problem that ends up being solved at the end. Okay, so let's begin our stories. The first one is The Little Mermaid. As you read with me or you listen with me, start looking for the setting. Where is it taking place? Is it in a magical land? Is it far away? Who are the characters? Do they have kings and princes? Is there maybe an imaginary animal that turns into a person? Because all these make the elements for a fairy tale. So, ready? Let's get going. The Little Mermaid. Far out at sea, the water is as blue as the bluest cornflower and as clear as the clearest crystal. But it is very deep, and if many steeples were piled on top of one another, they would not reach from the bed of the sea to the surface of the water. It is down there that the mermen live. The most wonderful trees and plants grow there, in such flexible stalks and leaves that at the slightest motion of the water they move as if they were alive. All the fish, big and little, glide among the branches, just as up here birds glide through the air. The palace of the Merman King lies in the very deepest part. Its walls are of coral and the long pointed windows of clearest amber, but the roof is made of mussel shells which open and shut with the lapping of the water. The Merman King had been for many years a widower, but his old mother kept house for him. She was a clever woman, but so proud of her noble birth that she wore 12 oysters on her tail, while the other grandees were only allowed 6. Otherwise, she was worthy of all praise, especially because she was so fond of the little mermaid princess, her grandchildren. They were 6 beautiful children, but the youngest was the prettiest of all. Her skin was as soft and delicate as a rose leaf, her eyes as blue as the deepest sea. But like all the others, she had no feet, and instead of legs, she had a fish's tail. All the livelong day, they used to play in the palace in the great halls, where living flowers grew out of the walls. When the great amber windows were thrown open, the fish swam in, just as the swallows fly into our rooms when we open the windows. But the fish swam right up to the little princesses, ate out of their hands, and allowed themselves to be patted. Outside the palace was a large garden with fiery red and deep blue trees, the fruit of which shone like gold, while the flowers glowed like fire on their ceaselessly waving stalks. The ground was of the finest sand, but it was of a blue phosphorescent tint. There was a wondrous blue light down there. You might suppose yourself high up in the air, with only the sky above and below you. In a dead calm, You could just catch a glimpse of the sun like a purple flower with a stream of light radiating from its calyx. Each little princess had her own little plot of garden where she could dig and plant whatever she liked. One made her flower bed in the shape of a whale. Another thought it nice to have hers like a little mermaid, but the youngest made hers quite round like the sun, and she would only have flowers of a rosy hue like its beams. She was a curious child, quiet and thoughtful, and while the other sisters decked out their gardens with all kinds of extraordinary objects which they got from wrecks, she would have nothing but the rosy flowers like the sun above, except a statue of a beautiful boy. It was hewn out of the purest white marble and had gone to the bottom of some wreck. Nothing gave her greater pleasure than to hear about the world of human beings up above. She made her old grandmother tell her all that she knew about ships and towns, people and animals, but above all, it seemed strangely beautiful to her that up on the earth the flowers were scented, and that the woods were green, and that the fish which were to be seen among the branches could sing so loudly and sweetly that it was a delight to listen to them. You see, the grandmother called little birds fish, or the mermaids wouldn't have understood her, as they had never seen a bird. When you are 15, said the grandmother, you will be allowed to rise up from the sea and sit on the rocks in the moonlight and look at the big ships sailing by, and you will also see woods and towns. One of the sisters would be 15 in the following year, but the others, well, they were each 1 year younger than the other, so the youngest had 5 whole years to wait before she would be allowed to come up from the bottom to see what things were like on earth. But each one promised the others to give a full account of all that she had seen and found most wonderful on the first day. Their grandmother could never tell them enough, for there were so many things about which they wanted information. None of them was so full of longings as the youngest, the very one who had the longest time to wait, and who was so quiet and dreamy. Many a night she stood by the open windows and looked up through the dark blue water which the fish were lashing with their tails and fins. She would see the moon and the stars. It is true, their light was pale, but they looked much bigger through the water than they do to our eyes. When she saw a dark shadow glide between her and them, she knew that it was either a whale swimming above her or else a ship laden with human beings. I am certain they never dreamed that a lovely little mermaid was standing down below, stretching up her white hand towards the keel. The eldest princess had now reached her 15th birthday and was to venture above the water. When she came back, she had hundreds of things to tell them, but the most delightful of all, she said, was to lie in the moonlight on a sandbank in a calm sea and to gaze at the large town close to the shore, where the lights twinkled like hundreds of stars, to listen to music and the noise and bustle of carriages and people, to see the many church towers and spires, and to hear the bells ringing. And just because she couldn't go on shore, she longed for that most of all. Oh, how eagerly the youngest sister listened. And when later in the evening she stood at the open window and looked up through the dark blue water, She thought of the big town with all its noise and bustle, and fancied that she could even hear the church bells ringing. The year after, the second sister was allowed to mount up through the water and swim about wherever she liked. The sun was just going down when she reached the surface. The most beautiful sight, she thought, she had ever seen. The whole sky had looked like gold, she said, and as for the clouds, well, their beauty was beyond description. They floated in red and violet splendor over her head, and far faster than they went, a flock of wild swans flew like a long white veil over the water towards the setting sun. She swam towards it, but it sank, and all the rosy light on the clouds and water faded away. The year after that, the third sister went up, and being much the most venturesome of them all, swam up a broad river which ran into the sea. She saw beautiful green, vine clad hills, palaces, and country seats peeping through the splendid woods. She heard the birds singing, and the sun was so hot that she was often obliged to dive to cool her burning face. In a tiny bay, she found a troop of little children running about naked and paddling in the water. She wanted to play with them, but they were frightened and ran away. Then a little black animal came up. It was a dog, but she had never seen one before. It barked so furiously at her that she was frightened and made for the open sea. She could never forget the beautiful woods, the green hills, and the lovely children who could swim in the water, although they had no fish's tails. The fourth sister was not so brave. She stayed in the remotest part of the ocean, and according to her account, that was the most beautiful spot. You could see for miles and miles around you, and the sky above was like a great glass dome. She had seen ships, but only far away, so they looked like seagulls. They were grotesque dolphins turning somersaults and gigantic whales squirting water through their nostrils like hundreds of fountains on every side. Now, the fifth sister's turn came. Her birthday fell in the winter, so that she saw sights that the others had not seen on their first trips. The sea looked quite green, and large icebergs were floating about, each one of which looked like a pearl, she said, but was much bigger than the church towers built by men. They took the most wonderful shapes and sparkled like diamonds. She had seated herself on one of the largest, and all the passing ships sheered off in alarm when they saw her sitting there with her long hair streaming loose in the wind. In the evening, the sky became overcast with dark clouds. It thundered and lightened, and the huge icebergs glittering in the bright lightning were lifted high into the air by the black waves. All the ships shortened sail, and there was fear and trembling on every side. But she sat quietly on her floating iceberg, watching the blue lightning flash in zigzags down on the shining sea. The first time any of the sisters rose above the water, she was delighted by the novelties and beauties she saw. But once grown up and at liberty to go where she liked, she became indifferent and longed for her home. In the course of a month or so, they all said that after all, their own home in the deep was best. It was so cozy there. Many an evening, the five sisters, interlacing their arms, would rise above the water together. They had lovely voices, much clearer than any mortal, And when a storm was rising and they expected ships to be wrecked, they would sing in the most seductive strains of the wonders of the deep, bidding the seafarers have no fear of them. But the sailors couldn't understand the words. They thought it was the voice of the storm, nor could it be theirs to see this Elysium of the deep. For when the ship sank, they were drowned and only reached the merman's palace in death. When the elder sisters rose up in this manner, arm in arm, in the evening, the youngest remained behind quite alone, looking after them as if she must weep. But mermaids have no tears, and so they suffer all the more. Oh, if only I were 15, she said. I know how fond I shall be of the world above and of the mortals who dwell there. At last, her 15th birthday came. Now we shall have you off our hands, said her grandmother, the old queen. Come now, let me adorn you like your other sisters. And she put a wreath of white lilies round her hair. But every petal of the flowers was half a pearl. Then the old queen had 8 oysters fixed on the princess's tail to show her high rank. But it hurts, said the little mermaid. You must endure the pain for the sake of the finery, said her grandmother. Oh, how gladly would she have shaken off all this splendor and laid aside the heavy wreath. Her red flowers in her garden suited her much better, but she didn't dare to make any alteration. Goodbye, she said, and mounted as lightly and airily as a bubble through the water. The sun had just set when her head rose above the water, but the clouds were still lighted up with a rosy and golden splendor, and the evening stars sparkled in the soft pink sky. The air was mild and fresh, and the sea as calm as a mill pond. A big three-masted ship lay close by with only a single sail set, for there was not a breath of wind, and the sailors were sitting about the rigging on the cross trees and at the mastheads. There was music and singing on board, and as the evening closed in, hundreds of gaily colored lanterns were lighted. They looked like the flags of all nations waving in the air. The little mermaid swam right up to the cabin window, and every time she was lifting by the swell, she could see through the transparent panes crowds of gaily dressed people. The handsomest of them was a young prince with large dark eyes. He couldn't be more than 16, and all these festivities were in honor of his birthday. The sailor danced on deck, and when the prince appeared among them, hundreds of rockets were let off, making it as light as day, and frightening the little mermaid so much that she had to dive under the water. She soon ventured up again, and it was just as if all the stars of heaven were falling in showers round about her. She had never seen magic fires. Great suns whirled round, gorgeous fire fish hung in the blue air, and all was reflected in the calm and glassy sea. It was so light on board the ship that every little rope could be seen, and the people still better. Oh, how handsome the prince was, how he laughed and smiled as he greeted his guests while the music rang out in the quiet night. It got quite late, but the little mermaid couldn't take her eyes off the ship and the beautiful prince. The colored lanterns were put out. No more rockets were sent up. and the cannon had ceased its thunder. But deep down in the sea, there was a dull murmuring and moaning sound. Meanwhile, she was rocked up and down on the waves so that she could look into the cabin. But the ship got more and more way on. Sail after sail was filled by the wind. The waves grew stronger. Great clouds gathered, and it lightened in the distance. Oh, there was going to be a fearful storm, and soon the sailors had to shorten sail. The great ship rocked and rolled as she dashed over the angry sea. The black waves rose like mountains, high enough to overwhelm her, but she dived like a swan through them and rose again and again on their towering crests. The little mermaid thought it is most amusing race, but not so the sailors. The ship creaked and groaned. The mighty timbers bulged and bent under the heavy blows. The water broke over the decks, snapping the mainmast like a reed. She heeled over on her side, and the water rushed into the hold. Now the little mermaid saw that they were in danger, and she had for her own sake to beware of the floating beams and wreckage. One moment it was so pitch dark that she couldn't see at all. But when the lightning flashed, it became so light that she could see all on board. Every man was looking out for his own safety as best he could, but she more particularly followed the young prince with her eyes, and when the ship went down, she saw him sink in the deep sea. At first she was quite delighted, for now he was coming to be with her. But then she remembered that human beings could not live underwater, and that only if he were dead could he go to her father's palace. No, he mustn't die. So she swam towards him, all among the drifting beams and planks, quite forgetting that they might crush her. She dived deep down under the water and came up again through the waves, and at last reached the young prince, just as he was becoming unable to swim any further in the stormy sea. His limbs were numbed, his beautiful eyes were closing, and he must have died if the little mermaid had not come to the rescue. She held his head above the water and let the waves drive them whithersoever they would. By daybreak, all the storm was over. Of the ship, not a trace to be seen. The sun rose from the water in the radiant brilliance, and his rosy beams seemed to cast a glow of life into the prince's cheeks, but his eyes remained closed. The mermaid kissed his fair brow and stroked back the dripping hair. It seemed to her that he was like the marble statue in her little garden. She kissed him again and longed that he might live. At last she saw dry land before her, high blue mountains on whose summits the white snow glistened as if a flock of swans had settled there. Down by the shore were beautiful green woods, and in the foreground a church or temple, she didn't quite know which, but it was a building of some sort. Lemon and orange trees grew in the garden, and lofty palms stood by the gate. At this point, the sea formed a little bay where the water was quite calm, but very deep, right up to the cliffs. At their foot was a strip of fine white sand, to which she swam with the beautiful prince and laid him down on it, taking great care that his head should rest high up in the warm sunshine. The bells now began to ring in the great white building, and a number of young maidens came into the garden. Then the little mermaid swam further off behind some high rocks and covered her hair and breast with foam so that no one should see her little face. And then she watched to see who would discover the poor prince. It wasn't long before one of the maidens came up to him. At first, she seemed quite frightened, but only for a moment, and then she fetched several others, and the mermaid saw the prince was coming to life, and that he smiled at all those around him, but he never smiled at her. You see, he didn't know that she had saved him. She felt so sad. When he was led away into the great building, she dived sorrowfully into the water and made her way home to her father's palace. Always silent and thoughtful, she became more so now than ever. Her sisters often asked her what had she seen on her first visit to the surface, but she never would tell them anything. Many an evening and many a morning she would rise to the place where she had left the prince. She saw the fruit in the garden ripen and then gathered. She saw the snow melt on the mountain tops, but she never saw the prince. So she always went home still sadder than before. At home, her only consolation was to sit in her little garden with her arms twined round the handsome marble statue which reminded her of the prince. It was all in gloomy shade now, as she had ceased to tend to her flowers, and the garden had become a neglected wilderness of long stalks and leaves entangled with the branches of the tree. At last she could not bear it any longer, so she told one of her sisters, and from her it soon spread to the others, but to no one else except to one or two other mermaids who only told their dearest friends. One of these knew all about the prince. She had also seen the festivities on the ship. She knew where he came from and where his kingdom was. "Come, little sister," said the other princesses, and throwing their arms round each other's shoulders, they rose from the water in a long line just in front of the prince's palace. It was built of light yellow glistening stone, with great marble staircases, one of which led into the garden. Magnificent gilded cupolas rose above the roof, and the spaces between the columns which encircled the building were filled with lifelike marble statues. Through the clear glass of the lofty windows, you could see gorgeous halls adorned with costly silken hangings, and the pictures on the walls were a sight worth seeing. In the midst of the central hall, a large fountain played, throwing its jets of spray upwards to a glass dome in the roof, through which the sunbeams lighted up the water and the beautiful plants which grew in the great basin. She knew now where he lived, and often used to go there in the evenings and by night over the water. She swam much nearer the land than any of the other dared. She even ventured right up the narrow channel under the splendid marble terrace, which threw a long shadow over the water. She used to sit there looking at the young prince, who thought he was quite alone in the clear moonlight. She saw him many an evening sailing about in his beautiful boat, with flags waving and music playing. She used to peep through the green rushes, and if the wind happened to catch her long silvery veil, and anyone saw it, they only thought it was a swan flapping its wings. Many a night she heard the fishermen who were fishing by torchlight talking over the good deeds of the young prince, and she was happy to think that she had saved his life when he was drifting about on the waves, half dead, and she couldn't forget how closely his head had pressed her breast and how passionately she had kissed him. But he knew nothing of all this, and never saw her, even in his dreams. She became fonder and fonder of mankind and longed more and more to be able to live among them. Their world seemed so infinitely bigger than hers. With their ships, they could scour the ocean, they could ascend the mountains high above the clouds, and their wooded, grass grown lands extended further than her eye could reach. There was so much she wanted to know, but her sisters couldn't give an answer to all her questions, so she asked her old grandmother, who knew the upper world well and rightly called it the country above the sea. If men are not drowned, asked the little mermaid, do they live forever? Do they not die as we do down here in the sea? Oh, yes, said the old lady. They have to die too, and their lifetime is even shorter than ours. We may live here for 300 years, but when we cease to exist, we become mere foam on the water and do not have so much as a grave among our dear ones. We have no immortal souls. We have no future life. We are just like the green seaweed, which, once cut down, can never revive again. Men, on the other hand, have a soul which lives forever, lives after the body had become dust. It rises through the clear air up to the shining stars, just as we rise from the water to see the land of mortals, so they rise up to unknown beautiful regions which we shall never see. Why have we no immortal souls? Asked the little mermaid sadly. I would give all my 300 years to be a human being for one day, and afterwards to have a share in the heavenly kingdom. Oh, you mustn't be thinking about that, said the grandmother. We are much better off and happier than human beings. Then I shall have to die and to float as foam on the water and never hear the music of the waves or see the beautiful flowers or the red sun. Is there nothing I can do to gain an immortal soul? No, said the grandmother, only if a human being so loved you that you were more to him than father or mother, if all his thoughts and all his love were so centered in you that he would let the priest join your hands and would vow to be faithful to you here and to all eternity, then your body would become infused with his soul. Thus, and only thus, could you gain a share in the felicity of mankind. He would give you a soul while yet keeping his own. But that can never happen, that which is your greatest beauty in the sea. Your fish's tail is thought hideous upon earth. So little do they understand about it. To be pretty, there you must have two clumsy supports which they call legs. Then the little mermaid sighed and looked sadly at her fish's tail. Let us be happy, said the grandmother. We will hop and skip during our 300 years of life. It is surely a long enough time, and after it is over, we shall rest all the better in our graves. There is to be a court ball tonight. This was a much more splendid affair than we ever see on earth. The walls and ceilings of the great ballroom were of thick but transparent glass. Several hundreds of colossal mussel shells, rose red and grass green, were ranged in order round the sides, holding blue lights, which illuminated the whole room and shone through the walls, so that the sea outside was quite lit up. You could see countless fish, great and small, swimming towards the glass walls, some with shining scales of crimson hue, while others were golden and silvery. In the middle of the room was a broad stream of running water, and on this the mermaids and mermen danced to their own beautiful singing. No earthly beings have such lovely voices. The little mermaid sang more sweetly than any of them, and they all applauded her. For a moment she felt glad at heart, for she knew she had the finest voice either in the sea or on land. But she soon began to think again about the upper world. She couldn't forget the handsome prince, and her sorrow is not possessing, like him, an immortal soul. Therefore, she stole out of her father's palace, and while all within was joy and merriment, she sat sadly in her little garden. Suddenly, she heard the sound of a horn through the water, and she thought, now he is out sailing up there, he whom I love more than father or mother, he to whom my thoughts clings and to whose hands I am ready to commit the happiness of my life. I will dare anything to win him and to gain an immortal soul. While my sisters are dancing in my father's palace, I will go to sea, which of whom I have always been very much afraid. She will perhaps be able to advise and help me. Oh. Thereupon the little mermaid left the garden and went toward the roaring whirlpools at the back of which the witch lived. She had never been that way before. No flowers grew there, no seaweed, only the bare gray sands stretched toward the whirlpool, which, like rushing mill wheels, swirled around, dragging everything that came within reach down to the depths. She had to pass between these boiling eddies to reach the witch's domain, and for a long way the only path led over warm, bubbling mud, which the witch called her peat bog. Her house stood behind this in the midst of a weird forest. All the trees and bushes were polyps, half animal and half plant. They looked like 100-headed snakes growing out of the sand. The branches were long, slimy arms, with tentacles like wriggling worms, every joint of which from the root to the outermost tip was in constant motion. They wound themselves tightly round whatever they could lay hold of and never let it escape. The little mermaid, standing outside, was quite frightened. Her heart beat fast with terror, and she nearly turned back. But then she remembered the prince and the immortal soul of mankind and took courage. She bound her long flowing hair tightly round her head so that the polyps should not seize her by it, folded her hands over her breast, and darted like a fish through water in between the hideous polyps, which stretched out their sensitive arms and tentacles toward her. She could see that every one of them had something or other which they had grasped with their 100 arms, and which they held as if in iron hands. The bleached bones of men who had perished at sea and sunk below peeped forth from the arms of some, while others clutched rudder in sea chests or the skeleton of some land animal. And most horrible of all, a little mermaid whom they had caught and suffocated. Then she came to a large opening in the wood where the ground was all slimy and where some huge fat water snakes were gamboling about. In the middle of